And the basic starting point is a very simple one. In the Middle Ages, we had a series of monasteries that had as one of their purposes to praise God, but their ancillary purpose, which was a much more important one, was to gather information and knowledge and share it and create new knowledge. So the official story that we learned at school was very simple. We had a Bible. It had two parts, an Old Testament in Hebrew, a New Testament in Greek. And the story that we learned about was really a story that took part in a very small place called the Holy Land, stretching from Upper Galilee through Samaria, Ephraim, Judea to Idumea. We have very clear maps of exactly where Christ moved, and some of those maps reduce it to just a very few cities along the way. When we start to look at the bigger picture, the birth of Christianity is in this little square, and of course this was also the birth, according to some of the stories, of the Hebraic tradition, and it was linked with developments in what we now call Iraq and Iran, and especially in Babylon. Looking more closely, in the Hebrew tradition, there were two main schools. There was one school that we could think of as looking east. We learned about them in school as the Pharisees. They were called the Farushim. They are linked with the Farsis, the Parsis, the Persians. These are the Jews, first of the Assyrian captivity and then of the Babylonian captivity. And they get linked with a particular prophet called Esdras. The second part of the Hebrew tradition did not like this eastward looking. They were called, using the Greek term, the Sadducees. They are known as the Tzadokim because they were interested in a lead priest called Tzadok, who rejected the Persians. And so we have an eastward and a westward looking Judaism. And this is linked also with the word tzadi and the tzadok and so on. And the whole tension today between some Hebrews in Israel and saying not very pleasant things about a gentleman living in Tehran has at least a 3,000-year history. The story is a little more complicated, as it always is, because between these two worldly oriented sects, there were also two spiritual groups. One was called the Essenes, the other was called the Nazarenes. The Essenes were called the Osenim, or the healers, and they had as their chief branch the Magi. Of course, these came from India, went via Zoroaster to, first of all, to the Caspian Sea, then to Susa, or Elam, Susa, and then these are the Magi, as in the Magi that arrived in Bethlehem at the time. On the 6th of January, which in the old calendar is the 14th of January, which is the beginning of the month of Magi in the Indian tradition. And there were the Nazarenes, called the Nazarim, who were healers, but also the keepers of the healing secrets. And so another way of looking at these Essenes, because they were both Essenes, there were the Oseans and the Nazareans. The Oseans at Qumran, the Dead Sea, and the Nazareans on Mount Carmel. These were linked, these were called the children of Tzadok, and these were called the children of Amen. So when we say our prayers in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amon, or Amen, or Amun, who's linked with the 21st of spring, which was also the birth and the death date of the person we now call Jesus Christ. These Nazarene Essenes of Mount Carmel were linked with what we now know as Mandaic, Aramaic, Hebrew. And they tell us that they came from India in 7 stages. I won't read all of this, but they started with the Bon religion in what we now think of as Tibet, and this got started seriously in 16,008 BC. Then they had an Indian phase, then they were in the linked with the Buddhists and the Taoists and the Ophites, the Magusians, another word for the Magi. They were the teachers of Pythagoras. They arrived in the Holy Land. There are differing accounts, somewhere between 1800 or 1500, or at the latest in their more developed version around 600 BC. It is this group, and then they settled on Mount Carmel, the one slope of which contains a town called Armageddon. And they were vegans, and it is this group to which Christ belonged. They had their own alphabet called Mandaic Hebrew, and it's linked with Syro-Galilean. And here you see, by contrast, Syro-Hebraic, and you see that the language of Christ was not originally the Hebraic one, the Hebraic that we now know today. They were linked with the whole mystical tradition of India, and they linked 33 levels of initiation with 33 letters, and these then became 33 levels of consciousness based on the 33 letters of the Sanskrit alphabet, and so on. And instead of the 7 chakras that we have in classical Hindu tradition, this reduces it to 5 chakras. We're not going to go into all the details. The immediate message is that what we learned at school is that there was a simple Hebrew tradition, one language that Yahweh or God passed down to us, and that was it. The story of the next few hours is that the story is much more complicated, so much so that it will take many generations of study to figure out exactly how this happened. So that although we have new devices like the ones you were telling us about, and this is of course only the beginning, because 1 gram of DNA can do 1 trillion CD-ROMs, and the first demonstrations of this has started this last year, but that's not going to be till about 2020 that we get this started seriously. So we are told that there were patriarchs. Well, here is one quick glimpse of the chronology to tell us that there was a man called Enoch. Well, that Adam, according to the people in Cambridge, was born at 9 o'clock in the morning of the 27th of October, 4004 BC. Around 3500 BC, there was a man called Enoch. Then we have a flood, and then there's this man called Abraham. When we start to look at the related maps, the related languages and alphabets, we start to notice interesting things. This is the alphabet of Enoch in the 72 sacred languages, alphabets of the Catholic Church. It bears, so we're here at 3500 BC. Here we're roughly 2500 BC, and here we're close to 600 BC with Esdras. There is a rather remarkable connection between these, and he is supposed to have invented the Hebrew language anew. So then we have Abraham. Now, we all know the story. He was that great patriarch, and the story goes that he was born, well, and immediately complications come. We are told he was born in Ur of the Chaldees, and that's generally taken to be here. He went north, went to a town called Haran. In the Arabic tradition, this place is also called Ur, and it is here that you will find in the mosque of Haran, or San al-Yurfa, which is one of its names today, where you will find buried Abraham according to the Arabs. He then went south, and then he went further west, and he arrived at On. Well, this is the story we all learned, and so basically, according to this, Abraham had an Iraqi passport. And taking it in the modern context. When we look more closely, we see that there are actually debates whether he went this way or that way, but the basic pattern is similar. When we start to look more closely, we start to realize that the situation is a little more complex. First, we are told that he invented two major languages, two major alphabets, that of the Syrians and the Chaldeans. There it is. And when he was crossing the river there at Iran, he invented a language which is called transitus fluvii, which is the Latin for crossing the river. And ladies and gentlemen, this is that alphabet. Of course, it goes this way, alphabet, Gimel, Aleph, and so on. If you go to the general discussions of these things, you will find that Chaldean and Hebrew are more or less equated. If you start to look more closely, that simple equation becomes, as so often, more complex, because there are 8 major versions of Hebrew, there are 17 major versions of Chaldean. So, just to remind you, those of you who haven't done your geography homework for the morning, Chaldea was down here, in what we now think of as southern Iraq. And then it became a part of what was called the New Babylonian Empire and stretched all through this area. And this gives you another map of the major civilizations around 600 BC. So these are the Chaldeans, these are the Medians. This was the media, is the message long before Marshall. And these were the Lydians and the Phrygians. And this also became part of, this was the Egyptian Empire, but at some point this and that became one. When we start to look more closely at these Chaldeans, as we said, there are 17 versions of this. We see that the alphabet, the Hebraean alphabet before Esdras, so before the 6th century, called the passing of the river, is also called the celestial alphabet and is also Chaldean 10. In fact, when we then look more closely, we see that Chaldean 1 is actually the caractère céleste, which is the word used to describe the alphabet that was handed by God to Adam. In some versions, it's the angel Gabriel who gives the alphabet directly to him. Chaldean 9 becomes the caractère des anges, and Chaldean 10 becomes the alphabet that we now think of as this transitus fluvii. And when we try to see the Hebrew connection, we see that Chaldean 11 is Hebraicum, and Chaldean 12 is Hebrew 9. So, although we talk of Chaldean and Hebrew as the same, the Hebrews only enter the picture at stage 9, and 10, and 11, and 12. And then 13 is the alphabet of Canaan. And of course it then gets a bit complicated because the Canaanites were in the area before the Hebrews arrived. Then Chaldean 15 is the Palestinians, who were also there before the Hebrews arrived. In fact, they arrived from Cyprus in 1179 BC, so 150 years before Solomon. And Chaldean 16 is the Babylonian alphabet. So the situation is getting more complex, and this is only the beginning. Then we know that there's this Babylonian connection. Well, what does this look like? Well, we're told that Hebrew is Aramaic. This is true. But Aramaic is another pleasant word for Assyrian. And in fact, it was the imperial Aramaic, also called Neo-Assyrian, that we see up here, that became then the alphabet that was used by the Median Empire, which then became the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And therefore, it was the Babil Alphabesi, and the innovation here was not in the letters, but the notion of putting these 22 letters into two groups, two columns of 11 letters each. And therefore the A and the L gives us then the Al, and then it's the W and the P, which is also then pronounced Vav or Fa, and Pa or Wa and Fa. So anyway, this becomes the Al, Fa, and then you go back to the Bet. So you go 1, 12, 6, 2. And if you think of it as a yearly cycle, you see you start here, well, you can start in this way at 21 March. You go 12 months. Then you go to the halfway point, and then you go back and you do the second side of the, if 1 is here, then 2 is there, and then you start again. That's where we get the word alphabet from. Or in Babylon, it was called Alpha, Be, and then C, because C was the 21st letter. And it was this model that was copied by the Hebrews. And so the alphabet that we think of as the original alphabet that Yahweh handed down to Adam was in fact an alphabet that was developed entirely by the ancestors of Saddam Hussein, to put it in a historical context. And it's not an approximate, it's a complete copy. But the situation is a bit more complicated, because there are also connections with an alphabet called Indicum. So here is the language of Indicum. This becomes the basis of an alphabet called the Premier Alphabet de Salomon. Solomon was, of course, the one gentleman in all the generations of the Hebrews who was able to get the 12 tribes to work together. When he died, Jeroboam managed it for 6 months, and since then there has been discord. So the great notion of the 12 tribes of Israel that we all know about is actually the story of something that happened for one generation. Well, David got it more or less started, but it was really David and Solomon that got it all together, and then after Jeroboam, it collapsed. In any case, that becomes the basis of what we now think of Hebrew 2. It is not a completely identical thing, but if you go to certain letters like the letter Z there, you will see that it comes back here as Zayin and comes back here. The next alphabet of Solomon, on the top you have the alphabet Brahmanicum, which is again one of the sacred alphabets of the Catholic Church. So we have been talking about a story that is really in the Holy Land, and we saw that the sources of that were actually in Iraq. We will now go south, ladies and gentlemen, because there is a link between Ethiopian and Egyptian, or the old name for one of the colonies in Ethiopia, or Abyssinia, or Kush, or Nubia, depending on which period we're talking about, is a language called Kuseum. And although we have, well, Egypt is quite a complex country, so we all know that there are hieroglyphs. These are fairly we can say with some precision that this started roughly 3200 before Christ. There were 80 sacred alphabets, which were magical alphabets. 12 of those were dedicated to each of the 12 zodiac signs. 7 were dedicated to each of the planets. The 7 major philosophers each had their own. The 24 major philosophers of antiquity as a whole also each had their own magical alphabets. This is not the topic of my discussion this evening. I am talking only about those alphabets which have recognizable letters which have an impact on Europe. And the first of these is what Duret in 1613 calls the premier alphabet égyptien. This is a book published in Paris in 1613 of 1,054 pages and remains the most learned single work in history on the subject of the alphabet. Although there is a major work of 1799 called Pantographia of Mr. Fry in London, that is the second most, and this is from Mr. Fry. Well, you can see the letters, the correspondences today, and you can see that the letters look slightly different. They are called Egyptian 1 by Fry, but you can see from the alphabet above that they are simply Cuseum. And Cuseum, this is from the 72 sacred alphabets published by the Vatican librarian in the year 1617. Well, those letters start to look familiar. In fact, they are related here to what is called the alphabetum indicum, which recur then as the alphabet of Mercurius Thoth, or Thoth, whom is better known to you as Hermes Trismegistus, and becomes the god Mercury by the time, or Hermes in Greece and then Mercury in Rome, and it becomes alphabet Egyptian 4 according to Fry. So we start to see now that letters that were in India are not only the basis for Hebrews 2 and 3, but they are also the basis of the first alphabets of the Egyptians. And the story, the plot thickens, as they say. I'll take you to another example of Indicum to remind you a little bit of geography. Abyssinia, or Abyssinia, was an empire that we think of today as more or less equatable to what is called Ethiopia. The problem is that Ethiopia in the old days was considerably more than the little thing that we think of today as Ethiopia. It was a vast empire, and there are ones that take it right down to effectively to South Africa. And if we had several more hours or days, I could tell you that this is the reason why the 250 or so versions of Bantu are all intimately connected to this. But that is going slightly too far south for our purposes. I take you now to a modern map of the 1st century BC to show you that there were considerable connections between East and West. These connections, although they were not taught to me when I was a schoolboy, go back slightly further than we are generally told, because from a town called Kift or Koptos, to which we will return, which is around here, and India, and especially the valley that we're trying to destroy at the moment in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan, the Indus Valley. There was high civilization in the Indus Valley with 8 major cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa and so on, who had, by 7000 BC, lively trading connections between these two continents. And this is the alphabet of Indicum of 26 letters published by Guillaume Postel an ancestor of the John Postel, the old friend who used to run, I think, what do you call it in America, the Internet Assigned Name, IANA, the Internet Assigned Names Authority. Sorry? IANA, Internet Assigned Naming Authority. He died tragically in 1998, but we were friends before that. Anyway, here is the Alphabetum Indicum. Now this is interesting because here we have the same alphabet coming up in the book of Palatino, and it's called the Alphabetum Suppotius Syllabarium Literarum Chaldearum. So the alphabet, or rather the syllabary of Chaldean letters. So now we have an Indian alphabet copied by those Chaldeans who we saw produce 17 other versions. And now it gets interesting. Letter by letter, you will see that they are copied in an alphabet called Ethiopian and Amharic. And at the end of the 26, this is 26, here there are 33, and the dots are the old ones that were still in the Abyssinian. If you take those 7 away, then you end up with 26, and then you're back to here. And you have 4 diphthongs. Chu, 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 cho, chow, kwa, 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 kwe, kwa, kwa, ku, hu, ho, ho. This sounds rather foreign. Well, they are foreign because they are also in Pinyin Chinese, the same letters. So there was a connection between India on the one hand, Ethiopian, Amharic. The stories that you will read about in the general histories is that when the Ethiopians saw the light of becoming Christian in the 3rd century, the Christians introduced them to the original idea of vowels, and they started to create these primitive things called syllabaries, according to the general story. But in fact, it's a little more complex than that, because you will see that this one has the Hebrew alphabet connected with it, and in fact there are also syllabaries. This is from the Ancienne Encyclopédie in France, and you will see that the letters have the Hebrew as part of the story. And it starts H, L, H, M, and then goes on. And it's again the same story. And then we find yet another version of this alphabet. It's called the alphabet Éthiopique ou des Nubiens. And here you start to notice that there are 2 series. This is going in the series that we now know of as the Abagada, so A, B, G, D, H, V, Z. But you'll see above that there are numbers that are in a completely different order. If you follow those, you go Ha, La, Ha, Ma, and so on, which was the old order. And in fact, when you go to church, well, this audience, of course, is far too advanced to go to church, but for those people that do go into such old-fashioned things, you sing Hallelujah. So Ha, Le, Lu, Ya. And so it is actually a summary of the alphabet when you praise God, well, and those other old-fashioned things that are outdated now. But here is then the 26th version of modern Ethiopian, and it gives you then A, B, G, D, H, W, Z, H, T, J or Y, K, L, M, N, and so on. So to just recap, if I write them in the original order, that's the series I get. If I change them around into the order, the sequence, then I get this sequence. Now this is, and you will notice in your close perception that we have one line, a series of words, Abagada, but below that, Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Daleth, and so on. Now this becomes interesting, ladies and gentlemen, because remember, God gave Adam the alphabet while he was in the while he was still in the Garden of Paradise. Or the other story is that God gave it to Moses when he was on the mountain. A slight discrepancy of 3,000 years, 2,000 years, but now we find that these primitive people down there, in those Nubians, down there, these primitive Africans, actually have all the Hebrew letters. And they are arranging them in the modern version of the Hebrew alphabet. Ovai, ovai. And in fact, we find that there are yet more of these funny alphabets. So one is called the Alphabet des Indiens de la Bibliothèque Grimanienne. That's a library now in Venice. And it corresponds to what we think of as Indian 1, according to Fry's classification. And it is based on an autre alphabet des Indiens abyssins, tiré des passages d'outre-mer, which is this one, which has as a short version Indian 2. This one is extremely interesting because we are told from a book published in 1619 that this was the official alphabet of India that was used as the basis of the Japanese and the Chinese alphabets, ladies and gentlemen. It would take me a few more hours to give you all of those details, and I'm just going to skip those because the battery might run out yet again. Let's continue. I want to just show you very closely what happens if I take the first 3 letters of that rather long one we just saw. And the first 3 letters are le fou. Just go back one, please, Jeff. Yes, so I'm going to take the first 3 letters here, and then I'm going to compare it to the one above. Yes? So, ale fou becomes the letter ale fou. Then I say fui to the U, and not to you, but to the U at the end of ale fou, and I get aleph. Beth Beth becomes Bethu, becomes Beth. Gamelier becomes Gameli, becomes Gimel. And in fact, you can, in terms of the signs, you can see they're similar too. So what happens is that if we take those funny names of that funny alphabet at the end and take those 22 letters, we see they actually give us not just some of the Hebrew general signs, they give us the actual names of the Hebrew alphabet. So Alephu becomes Aleph, Beth Beth becomes Beth, Gamaliel becomes Gimel, and so on. So the story of a simple alphabet having just been handed down by an angel or God or whatever directly starts to become more complicated. And we continue that complexity. So we hear that the Nubians played a part in this role. Well, the Nubians are here. The Nubians have many names, and there is a lower Nubia and an upper Nubia. And upper Nubia, which is down here, has a town called Meroe. It is the town that gives us the word Meroitic. And in 1750 BC, this was the first place of the first cursive writing in the history of civilization, to our knowledge. So we all know that there were hieroglyphs, and then there were simplified versions of that called hieratic, and then the next step in the simplification was a version that you could write cursively, from which we also get cursive and cursiva and so on. So we're right down here in what is now deep in Sudan, and then further up, just above, in terms of American imagination, just above the dam, there are these 4 cities near the cities of Karnak and Luxor, and specifically this town called Kift, which gives us the town of Koptos in the Greek, and the word Koptos is the word for Egypt in the Greek. So it is this section, and here you have Nagada. It is Nagada. You have Nagada 1, 2, and 3. If you go to Wiki, you'll find out all about it. But it is here, and here's Dendra that created the first astrological calendar of the sky. And so this part, somewhere around they were active 70,000 BC. High civilization arrived somewhere around 7000 BC. And by 4000 BC, this was where it was at in terms of the alphabet story, not in Cairo and not in Alexandria, where the great library was later. Well, these people, the old Nubians, created an alphabet, and I show you here the first 14 letters, and here you have the first 14 letters of the Coptic alphabet. And you will see that, ignore the Arabic here and ignore the Greek names for them, but just look at the correspondences this way. And here's the rest of the alphabet. The 15 gets dropped in the Coptic, but for the rest, it's a one-to-one correspondence. And that Coptic alphabet then becomes the basis of two major traditions. The one is, it becomes standardized, and so we have Alpha Vida, Gamma, Dalda, A, and so on. It is worth, I always had this strange notion that Greek started in Greece. Well, it's not quite as simple as that, ladies and gentlemen, because the first ABC that we know of is in Egypt in the 8th century BC. And the ABC version of the alphabet didn't arrive in Athens until 405 BC. We'll come to that in a moment. Here are some of those hieroglyphs from the old school. But instead now of doing A, B, they write it as a B, but they pronounce it as a V. And so you have, basically you have 7 double consonants, B, G, D, K, P, R, T, and they become then in languages such as Hebrew, you have Abraham or Avram, depending on your pronunciation, whereas some cultures, such as the Cyrillic, then make it into 2 letters, and then so you get an ABV, and others write it as write it as AB, but pronounce it as AV, so you get variations of the thing. Now what happens is then, on the one hand, this gets aligned with the Arabic tradition, and so each of those gets linked with, and the letter epsilon gets linked with 4 letters in Arabic, Old Arabic, Y-O-O-V, which comes suspiciously close to that important character in the Hebrew tradition called Yehovah, Yov, by Jove. And then the other, that Arabic correspondence becomes then formalized in versions like this. And the second strand of this story, so we have on the one side, this becomes the basis of Arabic. On the other, it becomes the basis of the Christian tradition. The general story is that Coptic became Christian in the 2nd or the 3rd century AD. Well, it can't be quite that simple, because when Christ was fleeing naughty Herod and so on, he stopped on the flight to Egypt. He stopped at a hotel which is 50 yards from the Coptic church in old Cairo. I've been there. So this alphabet becomes the basis of something called the alphabetum duplex Jacobitanum. And here we see now alpha Vita becomes alpha Veda. And you see there are 2 versions here. The B and the V are now taken apart. That Jacobitanum is also known as Jacobite or Maronite, and becomes that of one strand of the Syrian Christians. And here you have the Cophite, which is another word for the Coptic, and here you have the Jacobite. Here you see Cophiteum, and here you see yet another version where it's being used by the Coptic Magi, and Alpha Veda now becomes Alpha Vueda, but the tradition is clear. And here we see a variant that gives us then Alphabetum Georgianorum et Jacobitarum. So the alphabet that starts in Egypt, starts in Nubia, ladies and gentlemen, or Kush, or southern Egypt, goes to northern Egypt, goes to the Holy Land, and then becomes the basis of the Georgian language, because Georgia is, of course, a quite recent country. It used to be Colchis and Albania of the Caucasus, and then that was combined to create what we now think of as Georgia. And the man that did that between the years 400 and 430 was Mashtosh, who also did the new version of the Armenian alphabet, which traces its roots back to 17,000 BC. But as I say, we're not going into all the details this evening.
Repeat the number. The Armenians, how many thousand?
17,000 BC.
17,000.
Yes. So, in the beginning of the 17th century, a Scottish gentleman, head librarian at the Vatican, long before my teacher, Leonard Boyle, did exactly the same, made a collection of the 72 sacred alphabets of the world. He called it the Virga Aurea, which means the golden rod. And I'll just show you them for your homework tonight. You are to memorize these, and tomorrow at breakfast you will we'll see how many of them you get right. So I'm just going to go through very quickly to show you, give you a feel of what they look like. Here are the first 8. You've got those memorized. Then there's a few more. Then there are a few more. And then we have yet another bunch. Now, I'm not out here to analyze each of them, because then even the generous apportionment of time bestowed upon me by Magister Franz would be beyond the boundaries of the river of his generosity. But I make you attent, ladies and gentlemen, to some interesting facts. There are, well, things have got worse, you know, there are difficult times, so we've had to have cutbacks and so on. So the active languages of the alphabets of the world are reduced now to something like 6,500, 6,509, according to some accounts. Here we have 72 officially, but in fact the list is about 68, depending on some things. And the Hebrew alphabet gets 16 versions, so you have Syro-Hebraean, Rabbinical, Salonicum, Hebraic, Arabic, Afro-Rabbinical, Spanish Rabbinical, and so on. Without entering into all the details, I find it not uninteresting to put these into 3 simple categories. So a first category is the ABGD that we saw coming from the Nubians from India, and 36 of the alphabets are linked with that. Here I give you the most important ones of that, and of course amongst those are the Hebrew, and the hieroglyphics, and Eudaemeum, which is south of Judah, and then Indicum. 4 of them have the series A, B, T, TH. Well, these are actually the first 2 shapes. Arabic reduces the whole of reality to 17 basic shapes. Why 17? Because the moon has 16 days. Then it's a full moon, and at the 17th day you start to have it starts to decline again. And so the old Indian Sanskrit had 16 vowels, then 16 consonants, and then another 16 consonants. So 16, 16, 16, and that gives you then 48. And then you add some aspirates and things and get to 50 or 52, depending on your system. And then to do other things, you multiply the 16 times 16, and that gives you 256. And then that becomes the standard for the big alphabets. This is only 4 alphabets, except those 4 alphabets are rather, and here they are in the version published in the 17th century: Africanum, Arabicum, Turkicum, and Persicum. This refers to a little country with 74 million people. This is a country with about 72 million people. This covers about 400 million native speakers, but it also covers those believers in Islam, so we're up to 1.2 billion, and Africanum is another 1.2 billion. So ladies and gentlemen, we are near 3 billion people with these four little categories. And then the third major one, which only covers 17 alphabets, includes things that are closer to home. So we have Gallicum, Germanicum, Geticum, Gothicum, Hibernicum, from which we get, of course, Spanish, German, French, and so on. And of course, this is the ABCD model, and that covers another 3 billion people. So in this simple little list, we have basically dealt with a good chunk of the 7 billion people of this world, without entering in all the details. Now, the story that we're generally told is, oh yes, there were some very good fishermen long before Christ hired his version. These fishermen were called the Phoenicians. And we find, as we would expect, that they had an alphabet. Here it is. There are claims that this alphabet was directly copied from the constellations. As always, there are debates, and so you have different ideas about which letters correspond to which. Again, I won't enter into details. As always, one story goes that the Hebrews simply copied the Phoenicians, and of course there are some overly optimistic Hebrews that say, of course, we invented it all ourselves. And so they have their own version of the story. When we look at this in more detail, according to Mr. Fry, there are at least 7 major versions of Phoenician, and here is one. This is the 7th version, and here is one of the most important scholarly accounts of the 19th century. And we see that Punic, Pelasgian, Persian, Phoenician, Ancient Hebraic, or Samaritan produced quite a variety of ways, and so the notion that there was one version that was given to Adam starts to get rather shaky.
Fonts, beginning with fonts?
I beg your pardon?
Did they have fonts, the concept of fonts then?
The fonts go back quite a way, yes, but they were called writing styles, and so there were 6 major writing styles in each of the great cultural traditions. There were 6 alphabets in India, 6 forms of knowledge. There were 6 major fonts in China. There were 6 major fonts, of course, amongst the Arabs. So this is the version of Phoenician that you find in the 72 magical alphabets. And you see that it is the basis, it's a Greek version of Phoenician, and it is the basis of the alphabet frankique, according to the Abbé Tritem. But that, again, is not quite the whole story, ladies and gentlemen. So there's another version of Phoenician, which is clearly based on Chaldean 3. So 6 versions of Chaldean before the Hebrews arrive on the scene. And more interesting, there is an alphabet called Phoenician 1, well, spelled Phoenician as opposed to, there's also an old spelling Phoenicum linking with the Phoenix, which is clearly linked with the Alphabetum Syriorum, so the alphabet of that country that certain highly democratic countries are now trying to destroy, although it is the seat of world culture. And that is called then by Duret as the premier alphabet phénicien, selon Theseus Ambrosius, and it is a copy of Assyrium, which of course is the language of the Assyrian Empire, which is the home of that other terribly dangerous place, according to the highest levels of democracy, that place called Iran, which has the longest living continuous civilization in history, long before the nations that are now trying to tell us what civilization was about even thought of itself. So this Assyrium becomes the first Phoenician, becomes that, and well, it goes actually via Assyrium, goes via Syria and becomes Phoenician. And there is another version, Phoenician 2, here called the Autre Alphabet Phoenicien ou Ionique, which is a copy of a language called Saracenum, and becomes Saracen II, and becomes the Alphabetum Saracenorum. Now, in the later Middle Ages, the Saracens were equated with the Arabs and the Muslims and considered those terrible marauding people that came and civilized southern Spain and so on, and created places like Granada and other places that were much more civilized than anything Christianity had produced. But these Saracens were actually the foot soldiers to the Thamuds and to the Phoenicians. And they were down in southern Arabia. So it was their alphabet that went northwards to the Phoenicians and was copied then by the Ionians. And to remind you, Ionia is a city, but it is also a major chunk of the west coast of a place called Turkey, which of course was the first Christian country in the world. And you will remember that the 7 sacred cities of the New Testament are actually the 7 major cities of Turkey, ladies and gentlemen. And the people who are writing the accords with Turkey at the moment in the Union should remember that, because it was, after all, the apostles speaking to the Cappadocians and the letters to the Ephesians and the Miletians, long before they even got to Rome, were there. So it goes then from southern Arabia up to Turkey, and then in 719 BC, that becomes the basis of the Etruscan alphabet. And then in the year 405 BC, the Ionian version of Greek is established as the official form used in Athens by the Athenians. And that's the story. That part of the story we are told, but the rest we choose to forget. And please bear with me another 3 minutes, sir, and then I will be glad to answer questions. So when we start now to look at the big picture, we find, for example, that the stories that we think of as uniquely Christian are in fact more complex. So the Russian sources tell us that there are 3 versions of paradise. 1 in India, a 2nd in Egypt, and a 3rd in what we think of now as Mesopotamia. We hear that there were 3 major figures, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and that those are the basis of, well, the 3 main races, and also the Asia, Europe, and so on. The interesting thing is that that is the Christian version, and one of those Christian versions is this is Seth and this is Ham, and Japheth is up north. But the Turks have their own version, and there it's Ham, Seth, Japheth. And the Indians have their own version in the Sanskrit holy texts, which were finished at a pessimistic view in 1500 BC and an optimistic view 4700 before Christ. And so we have the same names. There's also a flood there's a flood in 642 major cultures of the world. So we have a movement, the Go West, that we are told about so much from your glorious country on the way to the glorious San Francisco Bay Area, actually got started a little sooner than this. There was a movement from down south here to northern Asia around 2 million BC. There was a second movement around 1 million BC. The Geno project is trying to redefine this in terms of genotypes and so on, with a rhetoric of being objective, but actually an ulterior motive of rewriting our history so that all of this happened 40,000 years ago, quietly ignoring the fact that there are archaeological evidences of things 950,000 years before that wonderful date. Anyway, I'm not here to solve that problem. I am here to suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that our notion that there was a holy text, and I believe in holy texts, but I also believe that holy texts have to be read with a certain critical eye, and I'm not quite as sure about that date of 9 o'clock in the morning on the 27th of October, 4004 BC, because at the same time, the professor at Oxford decided that the date was 509 BC, which sounded very original, except that was the date of the calendar of the people in Byzantium. I learned that Byzantium was those troublemakers there in Istanbul after the fact, when the Roman Empire collapsed. But their calendar is 1,000 years earlier than both the Hebrew and the Catholic Church. I was brought up a Catholic. I'm not trying to convert you to Catholicism. I remind you that the Russians have their old calendar. Their official old calendar got started and is still being used today in 7000 BC. I'm not talking about the really old ones that get started 20,000 BC and which are no longer used on an everyday basis today. And then there is a really old version that was reformed, the year that they reformed the city down in the south of Russia in the year 104,000 BC. And the latest archaeological evidence of the city that the Americans, unfortunately, were not able to destroy in their liberation, the city of Arbela, the latest archaeological evidence has proved that that had high civilization 148,000 BC. And this is not some rabid Kurd saying this. This is the highest level of Western scholarship. Arbila or Erbila, it depends on your pronunciation. It's about 100 kilometers north of Mosul, where the first bomb was dropped on a museum rather than on other dangerous elements.
Caves of Lascaux?
I beg your pardon?
Before the caves of Lascaux, you're talking 147.
148,000 BC, sir. That is like, yes, like 120,000 years before the caves of Lascaux.
Neanderthals.
Well, I'm sure that San Francisco has better names for it, but that does not change the reality, sir.
48,000 years ago we had language.
Yes. Yes, the Russians claim that there was, they have an old alphabet which they claim goes back to 606,000 BC. But I'm trying to come to the end and then we can come to the discussion. So our story began by telling us that there was a story of Christianity and Judaism that started with this little to and fro between two quite important cities. Well, in the course of the story, we realized that this part, down south, played a role that is not told about in the stories. And in fact, that what we thought was that little thing between two centers, little centers of culture, is actually a grander story that applies to the whole of this area. Because it was the model of Sanskrit that went down then to the south and became the basis of the various southern Indian alphabets. And from here, that model then went along here and became the basis of both Chinese and Japanese, so hiragana and katakana, and of course that's also the basis of the Hangul of the Koreans, but that's all really very modern. But that structure, which applies also to the whole of the Philippines, where the language is called the Alibata in the simple form, A-L-B-T again in another version. And then it's also the basis of Cambodian, Thai, Burmish, and so on. And then that other version that goes here gets simplified and becomes the 22 letters that then gets codified in Babylon and gets connected with that great tower, reduces the 6,500 to 22-letter alphabets for the most part, and some going up, but all the 50 and 100-letter alphabets get forgotten. The whole of the Russian alphabets get forgotten. The whole of the Chinese alphabets get forgotten. The whole of South America. My colleagues in Kathmandu, if you go to the greatest monastery of Kathmandu, at Pashupatinath, and you talk to the chief administrator for more than a few minutes, you discover that they were in touch with Brazil, 2000 BC. And this struck me as rather surprising and unlikely until I went to Brazil and did some study. And there is a language called the Umbanda language, or alphabet. And it is exactly the same letters as the alphabet that was discovered by the French mystics, as the alphabet here in the Indian Sea or the Arabian Sea, depending on whose side you're on. But in an area called Lemuria, which basically connects Madagascar to what is now Sri Lanka. And so there is a big picture that most of us have forgotten. That big picture explains why there is a sacred mountain here in the north called Adam's Mountain. It is the only sacred place on earth that is worshipped by the Buddhists, the Hebrews, the Catholics, and the Muslims. And why in Sanskrit there are words for China, there's words for the Ionians in Greece, there are words for Medina and Mecca, Makkah al-Muqaddimah, that, as we would say in Arabic today, but it was a holy place for Vishnu 1,000 years before Muhammad arrived on the scene, and his footprint is still there. They changed the caption. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not here to convert you to any of these religions. I'm not here to change you in any way. I'm just suggesting that if we want to claim to be the futurists, it is perhaps useful to remember that people have been working on it for a few more than a few minutes, a little longer than a few minutes, that this...
I'm sorry.
No, it's all right.
Machine, I don't know how to handle it.
It's an excellent ending. Called the new jazz. I thank you for your patience and hope that it will... the real message here is that instead of thinking there is only one culture that is responsible, there are many cultures responsible, and we have an awful... Scanning everything in, as Google is doing, is all fine. Other people are also scanning in. This is all fine. But ladies and gentlemen, I suggest that neither the solution of the Vatican in 1618 or Mr. Schmidt's solution for the year 2020 is the complete answer. It is only the beginning of a much more complicated picture, which will require about as much patience as it took me to give this lecture, and then a lot more. And I thank you for your even greater patience in putting up with my rather old-fashioned style without the press buttons and so on. I thank you most profusely. And I'll now happily answer some questions if I'm paid some water.
I'm curious, is there any evidence of an early language that was common to our species, a common species language? Did we always have all this, diversity?
Well, this is one of those lovely... The Germans have a lovely saying, there are no indiscreet questions, only indiscreet answers. If you read the latest gossip of the scientific world of the last week, you will realize that there was an article last week about the Ice Age language, which now claims that there was such a thing that goes back to about 15,000 BC. There is a general consensus that there must have been some master language. And that's about as far as it goes. And then I'll just give you some of the schools without going into another 7 hours of lectures. One of them, as one would always expect, there's an American, and he's almost certainly Hebrew, and so he's called Mr. Greenberg. Mr. Greenberg says that there are 7 language families. And those 7 language families are, being a good American, of course, they're all in the north, and they're all white. And so little details like Africa and South America and Australia, they're just forgotten about. And Russian, Russian does get some attention. So one of those is Altaic, and so on. The scholarship of the 19th century came to the conclusion that there was something called Indo-European. And that accounts for much of that grand sweep linking India with the, well, first with the Holy Land, but then also with Northern Africa and with Europe. My own studies have suggested that that is really a little simplistic, so that there are several versions of this story. Could we just go back? No, let me see if I can do it myself. That would be even more, okay. There is a sea route, and we think of this as the spice route. And this spice route is much more important than most of us realize, because there were links going north here, and of course it was the Queen of Sheba. And that was the reason why Sheba got in touch with Solomon, and they exchanged, well, they exchanged many things, perfumes and juices, and I will, this is not, I'm not allowed to talk about this in mixed company, but anyway, there was a route here, there was a route here, and all of this was going on. This goes back at least 7,000 BC, some people say it goes back much earlier. There was, of course, the main route of the Silk Roads, as we later called them. But the Silk Roads have a very long history. There was a gentleman called Cyrus I, around 500 BC, 525 BC, who established the first royal road, which went from down here all the way to the west coast of Turkey. It was called the Royal Road. Well, in fact, if we go back, could you go and find Abraham again, please, sir, while we're at it? So that was another route. There was a northern route of this, a version of this, and that northern route then connected, it's right near the beginning, remember? So just flicker along, thank you. And that northern route then connects China with the things going on in Europe. And that gets us here we are, yes. So this is called the Royal Road, this part of it. And it continues to about here and then links with both Miletus and Ephesus. And as you will remember, those are the two most important colonies. Ephesus had, I think, 90 satellite cities, and Miletus had 120 satellite cities that moved all the way through the Black Sea, because although Istanbul is there, it was the north of the Black Sea that was the center of civilization 5,000 years ago, or 6 or 7 or 8,000 years ago. And in fact, there's a province called Sindhi, a Roman province called Sindhi of the 2nd century BC, the north of the Black Sea, which had connections again directly with India. So we have a southern route, we have a middle route, and then we have this upper route, which links the Alani or the Alan Li to use the Sanskrit, the Chinese, or the Alan Liu, they become the Alani, and they become the Alans, and then lead to people of the future. And Alan Liao is the Chinese for his name. So before he arrived, of course, in the future of the Silicon Valley and all of that. There are these, the Russian version is that the version we hear about at school is that there was an Atlantis. And the general assumption is that it has to be near Atlanta because, and so it has to be in the Atlantic Ocean. Well, that is one hypothesis. There is a European version that says it has to be part of Santorini. In Plato's version. There is the version that I just told you about, Lemuria, which is in the Indian Ocean, and that has been archaeologically established this last year. And in fact, if you take a satellite map of Sri Lanka, there's something called Hanuman's Bridge in the Rig Veda, in the old stories of the Indians, and he talks about the Monkey King. Well, it's all metaphorical, of course, but the Monkey King walks from India across Hanuman's Bridge. Well, it's actually, you can see it from space, underwater. It's only about 4 or 5, well, it depends how high the tides are. But from space, you can see it perfectly clearly. The link is right there. There was going to be some important American project to create faster shipping routes, and they were going to destroy it, but there were some kind of local problems. The primitives thought that this bridge that had been there and saved civilization might possibly come in useful. It comes from northern. Can we go back to the one we started at? Sorry. Yes. Just. Sorry, I'm making him work overtime, the poor man. He's now doing a flashy expedition. No, you were actually there. You went too quickly.
Is this between India and Sri Lanka?
Yes.
Between India and Sri Lanka?
Now you can go the other way. Oh, can we not go backwards this way?
Well, I think we have to go back on.
Okay.
So, no, I'm not.
Yeah, now we're getting close. Yeah, one more, please.
Yeah.
One more. Yes. It's right here. And well, this is not a very good map, but if you get one of your spy satellites are very good at this kind of thing. You get a photograph of that. National Geographic has photographs of this, and you can see it. And so that's there. Yes, sir.
I have 2 comments and 1 question. One comment is I was once in Meroitic and museum in Khartoum, and he was showing us, it was not exactly Meroitic, but it was the place, and you showed it in one of your slides, south of it, I forgot the name, it's like Kofan, or maybe we see it on the slide. However, I see on a picture, he explained that the Nubian pharaohs had one god, which was a lion god, and this lion god comes out of a lotus flower.
Yes.
I asked the guy, I say, do I see a lotus flower? I mean, in the middle of the desert of Sudan. And then I said, how can it be? I mean, how did you know about the lotus flower? And I know that there are many ways of explaining it. However, this guy explained it as that he thinks that it were merchants from India who were traveling up the Red Sea, and then it's not so far to walk to get to Meroitic. And this is interesting. So I became very interested in traveling, and I even went to Zanzibar to study the way how they construct dhows, which is the oldest ship type known
yes.
in a written way to us. So this was very interesting. However, what I don't understand, and this is the question, is how could people in Kathmandu, in Nepal, share anything with people in Brazil? What is the theory on the connection of this?
Well, do you want the 1 minute version or the 7 hour version? No, I'm kidding. The flippant answer is this. When I was growing up, we heard there was something called the slave trade. I learned that there was slave trade that went to a place called, well, that land where everything is more modern and the future is already here, called the United States of America. What I wasn't told as a boy in Canada, growing up in Canada, as an old European, is that roughly 1 million slaves went to the United States. Roughly 1 million went to Europe. Roughly 1.5 million went to the Caribbean. And roughly 5 million went to Brazil. Now, this is the documented evidence, and I didn't start to get seriously interested in this until I went to São Paulo, and they have an African Brazilian museum, and they will show you the different links between these things. In the 19th century, there was a man from Liberia who went traveling to Brazil just by accident, and he was starting to listen to people, and things started to sound very familiar. And he, being he was a scientist type, but he realized that they were speaking what sounded like Liberian. Well, the technical name for the alphabet is the VAU alphabet, V-A-U. And he went back, did a degree in linguistics, and spent the rest of his life establishing then the history of this alphabet. But it was perfectly intact in Brazil. And in fact, when you start to look more closely, you realize that there are 7 powers of the gods in Brazil, in the native circles. It's a little, if we go into more complicated things, one of the groups is called voodoo, but Macumba is one of them, voodoo is one of them, and so on. And I won't go into all the details. The simple version of the story is there are 4 major strands, which you find in the Caribbean and South America. Those 7 strands are also found as the 7 great powers in Africa, and the 7 great gods are also the 7 gods of northern India. And in fact, those 7 great powers are also found in this Lemurian alphabet of 54,000 BC, with exactly the same letters. It's also called the alphabet Adami. It's also called the alphabetum Vatan, sometimes spelled V-A-T-T-A-N, sometimes spelled W-A-T-A-N. So there were connections this way, and although the slave trade became commercialized in the 16th century, there is no reason to believe that slaves have been quite popular for a long time. They come in quite useful, as the most advanced country in the world realized long before many of us. And so, these connections have been around for an extremely long time. And it is we were talking about the different places. There is the Russians talk about a high civilization up here, a kind of Atlantis of the North. This sounds rather wild, but they've just discovered lions in the plains of upper Alberta, and camels. Thank you very much. At least 80,000 years ago. This is supposed to have been about 100,000 BC. They then went south. They went south to this area, linked with the Altai. This, of course, is the most important publishing place west or east of Istanbul, until very recently when Beijing became important. But this is for multilingualism. Ulaanbaatar here is the most important multilingual publishing house of the world. And so by about 40,000 they were down here, and then sometime well, the latest version went down sometime around 2000 BC and then started to go this way. Zoroaster, according to the Indian sources and according to the Parsis, left India 6000 BC, went to here and then to Susa and went there. The Kurds took the same route about 5000 BC. The Druze did the same route about 3000 BC. And so there were many more connections when Buddha, who came, of course, from where's Turkey now? Sorry, where's Kathmandu? Here. So Buddha, of course, comes from Lumbini, and then he goes south, and then he goes back north and dies. But when he dies just at the end of the 500s BC, and his student goes then to Kandahar, a place where, of course, the enemy is now, but Kandahar was, for the last 5,000 years, one of the great centers of culture, and the Taoists at that time sent their leading person to meet the student of Buddha, and since that time we've been walking clockwise around temples rather than counterclockwise, which was the tradition introduced by the Bon in 16,008 BC. So the things that we think of as all modern have in many times much older connections and much deeper connections that most of us have forgotten about. So this gentleman has not asked the question yet. Sorry.
I understand the copy process. But are there any explanations why there are so many modifications and so many variations?
Well, the Christian version is very simple. God was angry that they were trying to build a tower, and so he made them all Babel, as in Babylon. But no, purely quantitatively, the greatest concentration of different alphabets is in the Niger-Congo area, where there are something like 1,400 different languages, not just different local dialects, languages. But there are these great patterns, and I showed you the 3 greatest patterns of the world today, and although 4 of them, that Persian, Arabic, African, and Turkish doesn't sound like much, it is almost, well, it's over 30% of the world population.
What's your understanding of why we evolved languages? Commerce, storytelling?
Well, again, there are multiple answers to that question. I mentioned very briefly that the early history of the alphabet is about magical alphabets. So the alphabets begin as alphabets of the priests to control the forces of nature. And they are secret. And they remain secret to this day.
In shamanic tradition.
The shamanic is one variation of that. And the very interesting thing about the shamans is that this is their headquarters. And their headquarters are here in the mountains. There was a mountain called Kantegli, from which we get Tingrism, and it was based on basic movements, and the 14 basic movements of Tingrism are the 14 basic consonants of the old Turkic alphabet. And in fact, the movements of the body are intimately connected with the movements, with the shapes of the early letters. So the earliest alphabets were all sacred. They were all linked with magic, and they were linked with controlling things. And if you were caught trying to give these languages to make them public, you were killed instantly. And this is all documented. In Egypt, they were called the Hermesians, from which we get then Hermes. Sorry, I'm supposed to shorten. Then what happens is that each class develops its own alphabet. So the Indians start with 3 classes. So you get the Brahmans, from which we get Brahmanicum. You get the Kshatriyas, who are the warrior noble class. They create their major alphabet, and that becomes the Aryan alphabet of the Persians. And then you get the Shudras, as they're called. Well, there's the Sayajas as well, but then you get basically the tradesmen. So then you get a business alphabet. So in ancient Egypt, there were 3 Indian numerical alphabets that were used for doing accountancy. I mean, these were the, the Ernst and Youngs of the ancient world. And in fact, if you go to Mauritania, there's an old alphabet called Hindi, which is the first 10 letters of the alphabet in numbers. And the Egyptians also created an alphabet called Davidian, which was used by the Indian philosophers. So it didn't only go this way, it went both ways. So basically what the ancient Irish, for example, from our learned Irishman here, created 5 classes, and each class created its own alphabet. So there was a fighting class, they were called the Fenians, and that was then the Fenian alphabet. Well, then more recently they got into more excited forms of being warrior class, but that's a side issue. Then there was the bards, and then there was the poets, and so each class created its own alphabet, and so on and so forth. And then the priests had a formal version, and then they had a written version. So that's the difference between hieroglyphics and hieratic. And it's the difference between capital script and, in majuscule and minuscule, capitals and small letters, or uppercase and lowercase, and it becomes then a way of separating it that way. And so the whole of the world separates itself